Welcome to this Q&A from the Fertility Alliance. Today we're joined by Ippokratis Sarris from King's Fertility, who's going to talk to us about some important research that he's recently carried out with his team at King's, looking at social media posts about fertility. So I wanted to start by asking you, what made you think about carrying out this research in the first place?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me to talk about this. And to answer the question as to why we did it, well, to be perfectly honest, initially it started a little bit as of a fun project because what I've noticed over the years, more and more since I've been doing this, is that people come to consultations and they come up with all sorts of questions and ideas, things that they've listened and heard. And initially I thought it was sort of a bit of fun. But more and more as the years have gone by, I've realized that I spend more time in my consultations telling people what not to do, what not to spend their money on, debunking information, rather than actually spending time telling my patients how we should treat them, how we should proceed. So the bulk of my consultation is don't do this, you don't need to do this, don't worry about this is not correct, don't spend money on that. And after a while, it started becoming a little bit worrying as to where's all this information coming from. And it's not just the consultations. At the time of a transfer, it started with the pineapple core, and then with having, fries from a certain fast food chain that I'm not going to mention. Initially, it was a bit of fun, but as more and more people were asking, I thought this is becoming very interesting. So, of course, we all know about social media and misinformation, but to be perfectly honest, at one of the cores of what we do at King's Fertility is we're a research-based sort of place. I want to realize that it's all good and great to talk about, research about, different triggers and what happens in this condition, the other condition, but let's see if we can actually apply this feeling that we all have about social media. Say, is it true? But use actual validated tools and do it in a scientific way rather than just opinion. The problem with opinion, as obviously evidenced by this paper, is that it can be biased, and I did not want to have my own biases prejudicing, and giving prejudices to sort of my sort of outcome. So we decided, okay, we'll do it properly. So we went out with my team and we looked at what tools are out there. So we found some scientific tools where you can look at social posts and you can actually objectively rank them rather than subjectively rank them. So we said, let's do this and let's see if this is true now. So what started as a curiosity and experiment then turned up obviously into this paper. And that's sort of how we started with why we should do it and to see is it true that indeed social media is full of misinformation or even worse, disinformation, or is it just a biased opinion, of somebody like me?
So how did you decide which social media posts or which particular posters to look at?
So basically, the first thing was to decide exactly what you said is which of the platforms to use. So we looked at the demographics and we looked at which of the social media that people between 18 and 34 use, which tends to be, let's say, the core for retreat. And of course, then we have, the 35, to 45 and beyond. So we had sort of to look as to what people use. And we found that the information the age group that most commonly looks at information on the social media platform, we found that Twitter, X, is the most common one, and also it was Instagram. We also wanted to look at Facebook, but actually Facebook, and I have to put my hands up, I'm a generation of the Facebook as a social media when it first started, seems to be something which less and less people are using. So we decided to concentrate on Instagram and Twitter, X, for that reason. Now, TikTok is another social media that you get a lot of sort of medical information as well. And we were keen to use TikTok. Unfortunately, the tools that we use, and we wanted to make the scientific and objective rather than subjective, worked on written language better. So they don't really work very much in the media of videos. So that's why we excluded TikTok, although I will admit that it would have been nice to have it. And maybe in a future paper, we will find tools to be able to look at that as well.
And what about the particular posts? How did you decide which posts to look at?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, we had to sort of figure out the time frame and to take a snapshot. So we decided to use Fertility Week in the US because that is the one where you get the most posting from around the world. Because of course, social media is not just UK centric; it is relevant from around the world. You can find information from everywhere. Also, we used only posts that were in English language, which again, one could argue that that potentially is a limitation, but we had to use with what we have, not just because the tools are easier to use in that language, but also because of the authors. We all are fluent in English rather than any other language of all of us. The most common sort of week where people use the English language for post and fertility was that week. So we chose that week. The second one, we had to look at the keywords and the hashtags. So we spoke with some representatives from patient groups, which are the most common ones to be used. And that's why we used the hashtag of fertility and infertility. So that's sort of how we started. Then we used some tools that look both prospectively at anything that is tagged with those hashtags, but also a second tool that looks retrospectively of anything, any brand or anything that's been mentioned in that. That's how we caught everything. And we came out with about 15,000 sort of media posts. But then what we wanted to do, we wanted to be fair. So we only wanted to include posts that either say that they're giving medical information specifically or giving sort of information about treatments. And we wanted to exclude anything which was a personal experience. It's not our job to comment or criticize lived experiences of people. And of course, that was not the remit of what we wanted to do. So we excluded everything which was a lived experience. We also excluded everything that was a emotional support. Again, is not for us to judge on that. This is purely about information from a medical sort of point of view. Then we also excluded anything which was an advertisement. Obviously, it's an advertisement. It says it in on the tin, so we excluded that. So by the time you take away the lived experiences, the patient journeys, the emotional support, and the actual things which are clearly adverts, we found out that of all those posts, it was only just a little bit shy of 1,000. So about only sort of less than 10% of the posts that fit the criteria that effectively in that sort of time frame were about giving medical information, either about causes of infertility or treatments of infertility.
And who were the people putting up those posts? Were they just influencers or were they actually medically qualified people?
Was interesting, what is an influencer or not? I guess you can be both at the same time. But to keep it sort of kind of simple, what we found is that at least where you can get the qualifications of people, in about 29%, so about a third of the times, there were fertility specialists. In about 11%, so just about 10%, let's say, was other medical practitioners. So it could have been fertility midwives, nurses, or doctors from other sort of fields. In about 17% of the times, it was alternative practitioners or holistic practitioners. And about 40% of the time was actually lay people. And in about 4% of the time was commercial entities, for example, a clinic or an organization like that. So from all of that, about a third was fertility specialists, and about 40% was just lay people.
Given that, your results are really quite alarming because you found that just 0.2% of the posts you felt were really fit for purpose. But how did you decide what constituted an accurate and fit for purpose post?
Yes. So obviously we had to come up with sort of some criteria, and the criteria that we used was to score with tools which, as I said, have been out there and validated for this purpose on accuracy, on credibility, on quality, and on readability. So it's based on those four domains, and then obviously you put all the scores together, and then you can rank the ones that, let's say, meet the sort of the criteria for each of those that are supposed to be acceptable or not acceptable in the realms of sort of what should be out there as information in social media, and basically what should be patient facing information. I think that should be very important. Clearly information which is meant for healthcare practitioners, like for example in scientific journals, you'll have a different readability that you would, for example, on a website, on a patient information leaflet, or on social media.
You said that some of them actually had a commercial conflict of interest. Would that have been visible to a member of the public if they were looking at them? Would people have been able to notice that?
Now, that's a tricky one, and the answer is yes and no. Sometimes you can, it is fairly obvious. Sometimes it's actually quite hidden. I can give you some examples of what I mean. So, for example, you can have somebody talking about a particular test. That can be fertility testing on sperm or on women, or it could be, microbiome testing, nutritional testing, whatever it is. But at the same time, you sort of can work out again, if you know the sector, maybe it's more easy that particular person that is talking about it might be linked to a company that sells the particular test, or has an interest, for example, in talking about nutrition, and they have a commercial interest in supplements. So this sometimes is very obvious conflict of interest. Sometimes can be a bit more sort of subtle. You have people talking about a particular treatment which might be controversial, and they're one of the very few in a particular region that provide that treatment. So of course, then they have an incentive to be talking about it. So it's sometimes obvious, sometimes more subtle. It might be more obvious to somebody like me who was looking for it, for example, and we're trying to figure it out. I think by and large, it's not that obvious to most lay people looking at it.
And what were the most common types of inaccuracy that you found in the post that you looked at?
Well, there were quite a few inaccuracies. And I think there's a difference between misinformation and and disinformation. Misinformation is where effectively given information which is incorrect. Disinformation is where you're trying to give false information with a for a particular sort of alternative motive, let's say, and reason. But if we look sort of in general sort of terms, the most common ones actually were about nutrition and about sort of dietary sort of fixes or changes that can help or cause problems with infertility. And supplements. That was, let's say, the most common one, and detox regimes. There was also quite a lot about, still, believe it or not, COVID vaccine and vaccinations in general, how that can sort of affect fertility. And then, there were some more sort of, smaller categories of treatments, which are basically either non-evidence based or have very, very limited amount of sort of evidence there.
Was there anything you found that was actually potentially risky or dangerous for patients?
Well, I guess the biggest risk that we found is really that some of these sort of posts potentially can cause delays in actually seeking correct treatment. So as a consequence, it is the time delay, and we know that fertility can be sort of time sensitive. So that is not a risk in itself as causing harm in an obvious way, but it causes harm if you're sort of having from a delay point of view. The other sort of that we found most commonly, and again, it's a risk, maybe not a medical risk, but is a financial risk, that all of these things cost money. And as a consequence, there's a risk to one's sort of financial well-being. And one could also argue that if you spend a lot of money on things that don't work, then you have less money for things that do work, and that in itself then has sort of secondary sort of effects. I think in general, what was one of the sort of main things that we saw, that even with posts that had correct information on the face of it, one of the problems is that they only talked about the positives of the test. They would say why it works and how it works. So that was correct. There was nothing wrong with that. But like as most things, unless it's absolutely obviously evidence-based and there's no other sort of solution around it, and there's no risk, which in medicine pretty much that does not exist, what most of the posts failed to do that were giving information about treatment specifically is they failed to say the limitations of the treatment, what will happen if you don't have the treatment, and what the side effects of that treatment are. So they only effectively talked about the positive nature of this treatment. They did not talk about the negative, about the question marks, and also the fact that potentially not everybody in the medical field would agree that these treatments work. So they were very effectively one-sided, and they were not sort of balanced. And that in itself can be quite dangerous. And that's in many ways is what I see as a clinician on the other side when people come with this information, and I've read this and this person said that, and then it's very difficult then to bring people away from that sort of mindset, and that can be dangerous, because at the end of the day, what happens is, and I'm sure you're obviously aware of this, is that as doctors we want to please, we want to help patients, and if at some point people insist on having some information, some treatment because of information that they've had, there's only so much you can do. And there are a lot of physicians out there, I'm going to put my hands up as well to say I'm one of them occasionally. It's so much you can do to say no, and you allow people to have some of these treatments and these additional therapies, which to some sort of extent you can balance the risks and the benefits and can have a nuanced discussion. But you can argue why we're having this discussion in the first place, and why is that being, that little sort of idea and thought is put in someone's brain. Then obviously over time it sort of festers and it's always there, and then you end up having to give in. And that is a more subtle sort of issue of risk, rather than necessarily about doing something dangerous at that point because one post came in.
We know that for a lot of patients, I think social media has become a really common place now to look for information. And I wonder if you'd advise patients to kind of avoid it altogether, or is there a way that people can use it and only be getting the reliable evidence? I mean, what would you say to your patients?
Okay, so first of all, what I say is that the genie is out of the bottle. There's no way we're going to tell to anyone not to use social media. And actually, there is quite a lot of sort of information out there, or actually, I should say not a lot, but there's some studies out there that shows that a lot of people now, especially younger generation, are taking their information directly from social media and medical care from social media. And actually, if you look at sort of questionnaires from, especially we've had some women about endometriosis and healthcare, they find it empowering and useful to be able to search themselves on social media. So I don't think we should say, oh, we should ban social media. People should not look at it. It is out there. People use it, and actually, people find it very, very helpful. So I think the question is not to use social media, is how to use it properly. And I think some of that is not the responsibility of the sort of the consumer of the information, the responsibility of those that give the information, and to some extent, or to a great extent, the social platforms as well. Let me give you an example. There are a lot of good information out there. There's not just bad information, and there's societies out there, ESHRE, the BFS, the RCOG, HFEA, and clinics that actually have very good information. What we found is that the good information is literally just swamped away, is washed away with everything which is out there. I mean, just to put into context, as I just said before, we found in 1 week 15,000 social posts with just hashtag fertility and hashtags infertility, of which less than 1,000 of those 15,000 actually qualified as giving information, of which most of them was actually either inaccurate or unreadable and whatever. And it's almost impossible to find the correct information out there. So in some ways, is how do we bring that up into the sort of forefront? We're never going to have platforms or people, banning opinions. I mean, that's not correct. But how do we bring the good opinions out there for people to be able to see? And I think the problem is that obviously by the time somebody comes to a clinic, then they can be signposted these correct places. But it's about how do you get that before they come to the signposting? Because in many ways, the information and the way that we sort of get information from experts has really changed. When I was a medical student, sort of growing up in this sort of kind of field, patients would ask doctors, and doctors, good or bad, would give information, good or bad, and that was the relationship. Now, what we find is that people first find their own information and they consume information, and then they go to doctors to either validate or tell them what they want to do. That shift has happened, and we need to sort of find a way of then, I wouldn't say necessarily protecting, but in many ways, sort of, aligning the correct information from those that can give it to those that need it and to take it. And that's where I think the key is, that the various ways that one can do it. But I think that is the important bit. There is also a little bit to quote one of our former senior politicians that, we're fed up of experts telling us what to do. I think also, we need to sort of realize that experts are experts for a reason, and we can't always be fed up. At the same time, expert myself, we shouldn't be patronizing. It's not correct. And that is, how do we sort of marry that together? So I think that is the answer. It's not a quick one, but it can happen. And I think that's what all we need to aim for. And this is exactly why there are, alliances like the Fertility Alliance to be able to sort of to inform, hopefully, patients or consumers of information as to what is correct information, what is credible information, and what is not.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant. And I have to say that is one of the reasons that the Fertility Alliance was set up in the first place, to make sure that patients could access accurate evidence-based information. So it's wonderful to hear you saying that. But thank you. That was great.